Uruk Hai, Uruk Hai, Goblins and Orcs. What are they, and what's the difference? Hey everyone, my name is Sam, also known as Mr. Stainless, and this is Game Anatomy, a series where I dissect the lore and give you the lowdown on our favourite games. In Shadow of Mordor, we went on vengeful rampages as we cut down Uruks and Orcs without mercy. In Shadow of War, not only will we be facing off against Uruks and Orcs once more, but we'll also be fighting against Ologs. But what is the difference between each of these creatures? Well, let's start with Uruks. If you've watched the Lord of the Rings films, you'll have seen Uruk Hai and the Two Towers. Saruman breeds these beastly warriors in order to destroy the kingdom of Rohan, but Uruks were actually first created by Sauron in the late Third Age. At this point, they were known as Black Uruks and were an elite force in Sauron's armies, and were actually responsible for conquering Ithilien and ransacking the Gondorian city of Osgiliath. It wasn't until later, in the War of the Ring, that Saruman began breeding Uruk Hai again. Now there is some conflict in how Uruks came to be. Some say that Sauron's Black Uruks were simply the strongest, toughest and biggest orcs in Sauron's army. Others say they were created by crossbreeding goblins and half-orcs, and others also say that they were created, especially in Saruman's case, by crossbreeding orcs and men. Either way, I think one thing is for certain, and it's that these warriors are pretty terrifying. In Shadow of War, we're being introduced to the Uruk Hai, giant battle trolls who will be joining our armies and smashing through the walls of our enemies. Uruk Hai, or troll folk, are actually Lord of the Rings canon and do show up in the Lord of the Rings film franchise as well. The Uruk Hai don't appear in the Lord of the Rings books, but do appear in the appendices. They were bred by Sauron in the final days of the War of the Ring to create a more advanced, more powerful troll that wasn't as vulnerable to sunlight. They equally have bright orange eyes in the canon, which represents their deep connection with Sauron, their creator. And while they may not be recorded as being able to talk like they can in Shadow of War, they were adept at combat and swordplay, making them a deadly foe on the battlefield. Unfortunately for any Ologs in our armies though, the Uruk Hai were completely wiped out after the end of the War of the Ring. Sorry Aslar. Finally, we've got the really tricky one. Orcs and goblins, what is the difference? Well, they're actually the same thing. See, usually when talking about orcs and goblins, we see orcs as being the above ground, regular greenskins we know and love in the Lord of the Rings universe, and we think of goblins as these smaller underground denizens who dwell in caves and the like. And in the context of Lord of the Rings, we'd actually be wrong. With regards to the Lord of the Rings universe, orc and goblin are one and the same, with the more correct term for the race being orc. In The Hobbit, Tolkien wrote in such a way that if taken literally, there are some instances where it seems like he infers that goblins are a subspecies of orc, but this isn't the case. As Tolkien's writing progressed, and as his understanding of this world he was creating developed, he started to lean more heavily on the term orc in order to distance and differentiate Lord of the Rings from traditional folklore creatures. But what and who were the orcs? Well, within the orc race, you've got a number of different ethnicities, so to speak. From the Snaga, who are lesser orcs, usually used as labourers for the dark forces, Gundabad orcs, Morannon orcs, and Morgul orcs. Orcs first came into being by the hands of Melkor, or Morgoth, Sauron's predecessor, who created the orcs out of corrupted, tortured, and mutilated elves. Bizarrely, because of this, because of their corruption, they hate themselves and what they've become, and they actually hate their leader, the Dark Lord, for doing this to them. It's this constant warring state inside the orcs, as well as their cunning and crafty nature, that make them such a formidable opponent. So that is the difference between Uruks, Ologs, goblins and orcs. They are just some of the enemies that we'll be facing in Shadow of War when it's released. But in the meantime, if you have enjoyed this episode of Game Anatomy, feel free to subscribe to be kept up to date with when new videos go live. But in the meantime, let me know what you thought of today's episode down in the comments below. I'll speak to you all soon.